You're listening to LA40 with Katerina Cozias, only on LA Talk Radio.
All right, good morning, LA. Woo woo! I'm excited. It is Thursday morning, a little past the hour, and you're tuning in to LA Talk Radio here in our TV station studio, and I'm your host, Katerina Cozias. We have an excellent guest for you today, and before we get started, I want to let you know that we've got a little bit of an interesting setup here. If you're listening on audio, well, I'm just going to explain it to you, and if you're watching us, then very cool, because we're streaming live on LA Talk Radio's network, and we're also streaming now on our Facebook pages. So what we have today, because we want to invite some callers in, I'm going to get to who this lovely gentleman to my left is in just a moment. I'm going to keep it a surprise. But we want to set it up in a way that for those of you that are watching us on the network, the Studios network, you know you can dial in. It's a dial-in show. It's 818-570-5085. I know you see that flashing on your screen. But if you're tuning in via Facebook, then we would love to have you interact with us and throw through any of your questions. So we have a second computer set up where if I hit, let me see. I'm going to hit him soon. No, I'm just kidding. If I hit refresh on my screen here, we're going to pull it up. But what I want to do before I do that is introduce who this lovely gentleman is. So, Mr. Chris Wise, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So Chris is joining us all the way from Marina Del Rey today.
That's right. That's right.
So Chris is local. Marina Del Rey, for those of you that don't know Los Angeles well, is probably one of the nicer parts of town.
It is nice.
Yeah, you're right. Right on the water, right on the beach. Mr. Christopher Wise, you are an entrepreneur. You are an author. You are a thought leader. Yeah. And specifically, we invited you on the show today to talk to us about the importance of loving yourself.
Yeah.
You have had to learn how to do that. You have a fascinating story, and I invite you to stay tuned for this story. And Chris is going to walk us through why it's important to love yourself, because not a lot of us do that, right? And how that can actually correlate not only to success in your personal life and to success in your relationship with yourself, but also into your success with business. So I'm going to bump it into your court, Chris, and what I'd love for you to do is take us through your personal journey.
Yeah.
Because it's a really riveting one, and then we'll talk about how all the different ways love can play an important role in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So share a little bit with us.
Yeah, I'll take us back to, and just so you know, as I'm going through and sharing my story, if you guys have questions, whether on Facebook Live or you want to call in and ask your questions.
Yes, and let us know where you're tuning in from, actually. If you're watching us now, last week we had people in from Portugal, people in from Switzerland, people in from Canada. So if you are watching and you are tuning in, we are live streaming on Facebook right now, so we'd love to interact with you. We've got you all set up.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Great, so I'm going to take us back to August 7th. 2013, and at the time I was living in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. I had spent the last year traveling the world. I had built an incredible lifestyle. I was running 3 different companies, 3 different virtual companies, and beautiful Colombian girlfriend. We're traveling the world. We had a 6-month world tour planned out. Just had been living on the beach, and we were flying into Los Angeles, into LAX. And we're going to be here for a week. And so as the plane is landing and starts to taxi at LAX, all of a sudden they bring the plane to a halt. And over the loudspeaker I hear, welcome everybody, this is your captain, welcome to LAX. We're going to be stopped here momentarily, customs needs to come on board. And I'm on my phone, I'm like so excited, I'm like typing, like can't wait, my favorite restaurant, the Melting Pot, can't wait to go to the Melting Pot tonight. And the next thing, I look up and I see this big black guy walking down the aisle. And we're in the back of the plane. And he stops next to my chair. And he goes, Christopher Wise? And I look up and I'm like, yeah. He goes, you're under arrest. And I'm like, what?
In the middle of the plane? So sorry, just interject for 1 second. So you're literally on the plane on the tarmac.
Yeah.
And these guys came into the plane to get you?
Not even at the gate. We're like stopped in the middle. Yeah. And they stand me up, handcuff me, and walk me off the plane. And as I'm being walked off the plane, everybody's looking at me like I'm a terrorist. And I'm like, what is going on? What the hell is going on? And in my mind, I'm like, why is this happening? Why am I being arrested? I even asked him, I'm like, are you sure you guys have the right Christopher Wise? Because I couldn't imagine what I had done. The next thing I know, they're handing me off to the Secret Service. Now I'm like really freaking out. Like, what's going on? Like, hey, I swear I support Obamacare. Like, what's going on? And to this point, they haven't told me what I'm being charged with.
Okay.
And finally, they mentioned two names. And I recognized these two names, that two people who 4 years before, now back in 2009,
Okay.
I had hired to help me get a loan for my business.
Okay.
Now, as I was going through the loan process, I realized they were doing a couple of shady things. Now,
The company you had hired to work with you and for you.
the company that I had hired.
All right.
And, you know, in my mind, like, I didn't think it was illegal for me to have this knowledge. And I was like, you know what, I'm planning to use the money for legal purposes.
I'm not the one doing the shady stuff.
I'm going to pay it back, right?
Right.
So, how could I get in trouble? And so my lack of knowledge around the laws, around conspiracy laws, is what got me in trouble. And so I acknowledged that I had that knowledge and I moved forward and I benefited from it. And that was the mistake that I made. However, if I would have known, I would have not gotten involved. But, you know, not knowing the laws doesn't, you know, prevent you from being liable for them.
Oh.
And so now here I find myself being locked up in prison. I'm not able to get bail because I've been traveling internationally and I didn't have any ties in Los Angeles.
Right.
And I don't have the $100,000 to hire a real attorney to fight this. I mean, this was going to be a massive, major case. And so I find myself stuck in prison needing to work with a public defender.
Oh, my God. Ay, ay, ay.
Yeah. And like, now, to this point, my whole life, I have been so, like, even at the beginning of the age, I started my first business at the age of 12.
Okay. Oh, wow. So you're like entrepreneur in the real sense of the word.
Yeah. And,
Okay.
and over this time, I had sold to this point, I had sold one company, and I had coached and consulted with hundreds of different businesses around how to grow and scale. And at this point, I was running 3 different companies.
Okay.
But the way I lived my life was just so focused, so driven, so purposeful. Like, and I had created like all the personal development stuff, and I had creative, massive results. I had I had the life that most people dream about living.
And the cute Colombian girlfriend.
And the cute girlfriend. And so it was just this. But here's what was missing, and I had all this freedom, right? I had so massive amounts of freedom in my life. But I had built my life from a place of being hard on myself. I had built my life from a place of just pushing myself so hard, not really truly deeply loving my inner child, my inner self.
But you know what? I just want to pause there for a minute, because how many men especially do you know in their 20s and 30s that really deeply love themselves? I mean, as a society, we're not set up to promote that.
Yeah.
If anything, we're set up in this paradigm of showing any kind of vulnerability is to be seemingly emasculating.
Yes. Yeah.
Or emasculated, you know?
Yeah, there's a general, in society as a whole, there's this general idea that vulnerability is weakness. And there's actually a perspective that one can step into. And fortunately, I'd already begun to make steps on this because I'd been on a spiritual journey for several years prior to this happening.
Right. I'd love to ask, just before to interrupt you, I'd love to ask some of our male viewers right now what they think of vulnerability. Like, do you feel that being vulnerable, does that feel powerful to you, or does that feel weak to you? If you're watching, I'd love you to call in or type in, because I'm curious to know sort of what the men out there think of that.
Yeah, and so so here I am in prison, and I'm just like, I'm trapped. And in prison, vulnerability is like, you can't be vulnerable because vulnerability is viewed as weakness.
Especially in prison.
Yeah,
I can't imagine.
And if you're viewed as weak, then you could be taken advantage of. And so, going back to what I was talking about, my whole life been so driven, so hard on myself. Had begun to get, 2 years before I had learned this. I'd been working with this spiritual mentor, and he taught me this practice.
Okay.
And I had begun to do this practice prior to getting in prison, and so it gave me the tools to really have prison be this really transformational experience. And this practice was to my own inner child, to my own inner self. One of the ways that I viewed it was like my 5-year-old little boy inside. And so it was to that aspect of self, my inner self or my inner child, that I would say the words, I love you. I love you. I love you. I love you. And when I first started doing this and I learned this practice, it was a little challenging and it took me some time to get used to and get really into it, but I knew the power of it because I had done so much other stuff that the simplicity of this and the power and how I really felt it impacting me internally, I was like, wow, this is it, and this is powerful.
And you had started this practice. You had been exposed to it 2 years prior to being in prison.
Yeah.
Okay. I imagine it came in really handy.
Yeah.
Once you got there.
Yeah. So here I am, and my first night in prison, and I just intuitively know because so driven for looking for freedom, but there was this, but I had in the pursuit of freedom, I had built this internal prison of control because I felt like in order for me to create my life the way that I want it to, I have to control my thoughts, because all the personal development stuff that I told me is like, oh, I can't think negative thoughts.
Right, negative thoughts is bad, right?
Yeah. Can't say the words but or can't or try or like all these things, right? So I got to be in control of my thoughts, can't have negative thoughts. And then I got to be in control of my emotions. Like I can't get into negative emotional states. That I can only stay, and I only want to be in powerful, positive states because that's going to put me in powerful, positive action so that I can create the life of my dreams. And so I had done this, but it was done this from this grip, from this grip of control. And in order to, have done all this, there was this internal prison that I created for myself. But I hadn't realized this at the time, right? And so in prison, my very first night, my intuition spoke to me, and it told me to surrender.
What does that even mean? Wow.
To completely, and what that meant was just to completely let go, to surrender into this process, to not to fight it. Now that didn't mean not to try to get the best outcome as possible, but not to fight against the things that I wasn't in control of.
Wow.
And that's what I was all about prior, was like, if something wasn't working out the way that I wanted it to, like, I'm going to fight it, it's not okay, and I'm going to do whatever I can to try to control circumstances so that I can get the outcome that I wanted.
So this was 100% reversal, 180 degrees the other way.
Well, yeah.
How did that feel, though, letting go?
It was scary. Can we use profanity on your show?
Yes.
I don't know. It was scary as fuck.
Yeah.
I mean, it was horrifying. But I knew this was something just innately told me, guided me down this path of letting go. Yeah. Because there was a level of freedom, though I had those external freedom, there was a level of internal freedom that I felt was missing. And something was telling me, by letting go of trying to control, letting go of all these different things that I was attached to, that there was going to be a new level of freedom that I would access. But going through that journey was so scary and so hard. Now,
how do you go through a journey like that in a place as masculinely violent as prison?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. But what, so I think that's one of the things that I feel most proud about. So I'll give you this, the framework. Like in prison, there's this whole prison mindset.
Okay.
And there's this prison politics. There's when you go into prison, it's like you have to act like a prisoner. And to act like a prisoner, that means that there's prisons run by the race. And for example, if somebody from my race is getting in a fight with somebody from another race, I have to back up my race, even if I don't know what's going on, even if I don't agree. I have to fight and back up with my race. And if I don't, I'm going to get beat up by my own race. And if I do and get caught, then everybody who's in the fight, no matter who started it or whatever, gets sent to the hole. And that's just not a fun place to be. So it's like a lose-lose situation. It's lose-lose all around. And none of these rules and these prison politics made sense to me.
Okay.
Because the way I saw it is, I'm a human being, you're a human being.
Right.
We're both going through a difficult time, and I'm going to treat you with kindness and respect.
Okay. How did that go over?
Well, for the most part, it went over pretty well. I made a lot of friends with I was friends with everybody, but there was people in my own race that hated me, and there ended up creating some problems because I. Do
you have an example of some of the problems?
I do. I will. I'll give you those.
Yeah.
So there was. It created problems, but I chose to be right. So this whole paradigm. I realized that if I would have bought into that paradigm of this whole prison mindset, I would be giving up more freedom. And so this is actually kind of a point out of a lesson here, that there are environments that you may step into that have a certain paradigm around them, and when you get into them, you may feel that there's a lack of freedom or a lack of self-expression or a lack of love or whatever it is, and just because there's a group or just because there's a certain way of being that certain people are operating, you don't have to choose to be in that just because other people are. You have the ability to choose what you feel is the most powerful, and that's what I chose. I didn't choose to buy into the prison mindset, which if you imagine, it's just me against really the whole prison system. Right. In a sense, but the way, to me, it just didn't, I couldn't do it. It just didn't make sense. What I chose to do is I chose to go through prison in the most kind and loving way.
Okay. That sounds so counterintuitive.
And that began with being kind and loving towards myself.
Right. So were you sitting in your cell at night doing this I love you practice then?
Yeah, you know, it was funny. I had a lot of time on my hands. Yeah. And so, you know, I would meditate and do this I love you practice for 2 to 4 hours a day.
Wow.
Now,
if you're just tuning in, just to interrupt, we're here with Chris Wise. He is an author, a thought leader, an entrepreneur by trade, but he's here sharing a really riveting story about his time in prison. He was tied up with a sort of a white-collar fraud banking thing that wasn't necessarily your fault, but you were affiliated with it, and so you got arrested, and you're now in prison, and you're getting yourself through prison by stepping into a place of love. So for those of you tuning in now, this is Chris Wise continuing with his story of being in prison and trying to love himself through that.
Yeah. You know, so then one day I'm in the lunchroom and I'm playing cards with this older man named Joe. And Joe's a little emotionally unstable, and I'm beating him cards. Boom, 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 beating him. He's getting angrier and angrier and angrier. Then all of a sudden, after one hand I beat him, he slams his hands down on the table, he stands up, and he's like, "Come on, let's fight!" Now, I had visualized a moment like this happening. You know, a few weeks earlier in my cell, I was meditating, doing this the I love you practice. And see, I'd also decided not to respond to violence with violence.
In prison.
In prison.
That's got to be tough.
And this wasn't a decision from a place of weakness, because I've had a lot of Krav Maga martial arts training. Like, I know how to hurt somebody. This was done from a place of deep internal strength and security within myself. Because I had done a lot of personal development work, and because I had done a lot of spiritual work, and because I had already done this I love you practice, and because being an entrepreneur and being successful in the world, I had a lot of internal self-confidence. And so I was just like, you know what? I'm not gonna respond to violence with violence. But then I was like, well, what would I do? And so then I thought, well, wonder what would happen if I replied to somebody who was trying to fight me with, "I love you." Now, this was like, it's from a place of confidence, but like sheer curiosity. Like, like here, this is this experimental world that I get to like try this out and see what would happen.
So here's this guy, he's standing up, he's telling you, "Let's fight," and you're thinking, I wonder what would happen if I said, "I love you"?
Well, I had already thought about this, not in the moment.
Right, because you had thought of, if I find myself in this situation.
Yeah, so
right?
I began to visualize somebody saying, "Let's fight," and me replying with, "I love you." And so now here I am in the lunchroom, and Joe is standing in front of me. He's like, "Come on, let's fight." And I stand up, and I look him in the eyes, and I say, "I love you. I love you." And not a weak or a soft "I love you," but an "I love you" with teeth. And all of a sudden, Joe, he looks lost and confused like a deer in headlights, and he turns and walks away. It was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen.
He had no idea how to respond to you. Like, no idea.
Yeah.
Jesus.
And he was afraid of me after that. He was afraid of me. He avoided me.
Wow. How did you feel after that?
I was like, holy fuck, like, that shit worked. I was like,
the power of loving.
Yeah, and it wasn't like,
wow.
Yeah.
So what did everyone else there think? Did you have any people watching this?
I don't know. There's
did
people
you have anyone
around.
come up to you and say, did they call you a pussy for not fighting?
No, there was nobody really around. I think people really respected me, the way I carried myself. Even though I didn't buy into the whole system, I feel like a lot of people actually respected the fact that I didn't buy into the way everybody else did. Because I feel like when you buy into a paradigm that takes away freedom, you feel that. And so...
And I want to ask on that note, right, some of our male viewers, again, I'm inviting the male viewers to comment, but how often do you feel like I have no choice but to fight? right? If I don't fight, then I'm going to look weak. I'm going to look ineffective.
Yeah.
And that can be fighting physically and fighting emotionally, right? How tiring is fighting emotionally sometimes?
Yeah, and the power is that there is a choice. You have a choice. You have a choice in how you respond.
Yeah.
But it takes, it actually takes greater internal strength to not fight, to respond from a loving place with confidence. We're not talking about a pussy kind of love here. We're talking about a love that has fucking power. And that's something that you can access. But in order to access that depth of internal strength, it requires you to go into the things that you're most afraid of. Because violence comes from a place of repressed anger. And anger is arising out of a place of repressed sadness. And so there's emotions that men and women have not looked at. Sadness, fear, anger. That is what erupts violence out of, that has not been looked at because you're too afraid. Because someone's too afraid to face those things. And the power of this I love you practice. And it's because, here's the thing. You have to feel safe in order to be able to face those emotions. You have to be safe in order to feel those emotions. And, one of the disadvantages of the whole personal development paradigm and this, it's not okay to feel negative emotions and state change, like let me step into a powerful state, is that it can lead you, for those who haven't developed this internal love, who haven't created an internal foundation of love within themselves, then use these methodologies to avoid, which can be very useful, to avoid feeling negative emotions and avoid feeling these things.
So how does one step into embracing those emotions, though? Because you said something earlier. You said, it can be really scary. Why are we as human beings so scared to go into some of those softer emotions? Yeah. Even as women, Yeah,
it requires, because there's a lack of love and a lack of internal safety. So you don't feel safe and you haven't loved yourself enough to be able to feel those emotions, so they're avoided or escaped out of.
Now, do you find or do you fear that this younger generation that is actually even more, in my opinion, maybe I'll offer my opinion and then I'll ask you yours, with respect to this whole social media, digital age, everyone's on their cell phones, they're not connecting emotionally with other people, let alone with themselves. Do you feel that it may be harder for that generation to tap in? Or do you think as a human experience, it's just a tough world because we are moving along in a comparative fashion?
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much generational as it may be more parental and the type of environment that you were brought up in. And this kind of actually goes back to something we were originally talking about. We're not taught. We're taught to love others. We're taught to pay it forward, to be kind, and the power of that, to give and the power of that. But we're never really taught how to really give to ourselves or how to really love ourselves. And I feel like as people learn how to really love themselves, and I think one of the easiest and most powerful ways to love oneself is through this I love you practice, just by saying the words I love you to you, that this becomes such a transformational catalyst for everything in life, for how you relate in your relationships, for how you perform in business. And it just as a business side note for a second,
sure.
Think about this. Do you think you would perform better if you're beating yourself up, or if you actually are operating from a place of being kind to yourselves? Now, for those of you that have only operated from a place of
self-judgment, criticism,
of beating yourself up, you're like, well, beating myself up is the way to go. But you think about this. You're a biological organism. You are an emotional being. As a human being, if you didn't have love as a child and as a baby, babies die if they don't have physical touch. Babies would die if they don't have love. We are, as human beings, we need love. And so there's actually scientific studies that have shown how habits actually stay, when you're kind to yourself, that you actually develop stronger habits more quickly, and those habits stay around. And so this goes back to the same thing in terms of performance. you will actually perform better. As opposed to saying, oh, you didn't succeed, you need to try harder, oh, you suck. But if you're actually, you know what, hey, didn't make it this time, but you're going to do better next time, and I fucking love you. You are so awesome. You are so amazing. Think about it as a coach, like this internal voice, if you were like, oh, beating myself up is the way to get results. Would you want a coach that would poop on you when you didn't succeed? No. The best coaches, the highest performance coaches in the world come from a place of, yes, strong mental strength, but a place of building you up.
And I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think, over time, one of the characteristics that I've recognized in really successful people is their ability to be kind to themselves through their failures. And it's because they were kind to themselves through their failures that they got up that next time and tried again, and got up that next time and tried again. And maybe the 20th time was the time when their business actually exploded. But if they had been hard on themselves and given up and just quit and said, okay, I'm a loser, I'm going to sit on the couch and drink beer and watch football, that would have been the end of that. So I think you're on to something there about how being loving to yourself and loving yourself through some of these hard times is actually the catalyst for business success.
Yeah, and I think this is a big distinction, especially for men. Being loving toward yourself and kind to yourself does not take away from high levels of discipline and mental performance and the effort and action that it takes. But it's like all of that's still needed, but it's what's the space underneath out of which those actions are arising out of.
So what I want to do out of now is have you walk us through this I love you practice a little bit, because people are watching, and I want, we're talking about it in theory. So someone at home that maybe is feeling a little bit frustrated, like how many of you, especially, I know, and I've talked about this before on the show, right? You get to this point where you're approaching your 40s, you're approaching your 50s, and you look at your life and you say, am I really where I wanted to be? Maybe you are, and if you are, fantastic. Maybe you're not. And if you're not, how much of yourself is falling into some of those fear-based emotions of criticism, self-judgment, anger, frustration, shame? So in order to erase those, we can come to ourselves from a place of love. So can you show us how?
Yeah, and I'd also want to say, even if you have, like I had achieved massive success in my life, but I hadn't done it from a loving place. So even if you're somebody that has built an incredible life, have you actually done that from a kind and loving place to yourself? So this doesn't mean, a lack of love doesn't mean that you won't create success. It just means you can create life from a place of already being fulfilled and loved, as opposed to creating life from a place of not feeling fulfilled and loved. Like, how amazing would it be, and this is what this practice gives you access to, is creating your life, no matter what type of life that you want, from a place of already having everything internally that you want, from already feeling fully satisfied and fully loved, because you have become the source of that for yourself, as opposed to relying on the results and the circumstances and the relationships and the love that you try to get externally. When you've already given that to yourself, all of that just becomes a gift. All of that just becomes icing on the cake.
I would invite you viewers, if you haven't already clicked in to start following Chris, he had a really interesting, because I follow you, you had a really interesting post on your Facebook page yesterday. You did a live feed talking about the importance of coming to the world with some of these, I don't want to call them softer emotions because that gives people the wrong perception. I would call them more refined emotions, right? So if you haven't been following Chris, Chris Wise, get on his page and watch his video from yesterday, was it? Your live video, because it talked a little bit about what you're talking. You walked people through the framework.
The foundation of love.
Right. Yeah, and it was it's sort of a catalyst to what you're talking about here.
Yeah. So going back to this I love you practice. So if for a moment I'll just walk you guys all through this.
Yeah. Okay.
Take a moment to bring your attention into your. I'm going to give you a couple different words. Entering your heart space, into your internal self, into your inner child. Underneath, what would be underneath who you think you are as a person, as a male or female, as all your identity that you have, it's underneath that. Who you really, I even put it as who you really are. And go ahead and bring your attention to that space. And as you bring your attention to that space, and you can just repeat after me as we do this. And we're going to say the words, I love you, to this part of ourselves. And we're going to use the reason that we're using the words, I love you, versus I love myself, because myself, you can think of myself, those words as like, that's who you think you are. That's your identity, your role or your profession, or yourself as a male or a female, like that. Most people, I love myself. Most people have a good, healthy,
most people think they love themselves, yeah.
Most people have a good, healthy relationship with their ego,
sure.
to their identity. Right? So we're not talking about that aspect of yourselves, which is why we're using the words I love you. Now, as you begin to think about saying this to yourself, if you feel some hesitation or that's weird or like, I don't know, I would suggest to you that this indicates that there's been a lack of love to this part of yourself. Because if this part of ourselves has been fully loved, fully acknowledged, fully seen, there would be no resistance to it. And so, just like anything, the first time you do something, a new way of receiving love, a new way of this aspects could feel uncomfortable to your subconscious. And so, as we do this, just, that might be okay. Just there might feel a little uncomfortable. So.
I'm going to close my eyes because I'm feeling, I get into my heart space with my eyes a little closed. So if you're watching, I invite you to do this with us. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, closing your eyes, and you might, even if you want to put your hand on your heart as well, and you can just repeat after me. I love you.
I love you.
I love you.
I love you.
Just feel that so deeply inside. I love you.
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 I love you. So by doing this, and you're saying this to yourself, and you're really tapping into that inner child, I suppose, right?
Yeah, this is giving. Most people ignore this aspect of self. They don't bring attention to it.
Now, I have to share with you watching that Chris and I had gotten together to prepare a little bit for this interview, and so he walked me through this I Love You practice earlier this week, and it is powerful. I'm going to be really honest in sharing that I had a tough time getting through it. And for anyone that knows me, you know that I'm a fairly self-confident person, right? I have a lot of confidence. I don't shy away from a lot of things. I like myself. And yet I hadn't even realized under the surface how much was kind of in there. For me, as a woman approaching her 40s and basically coming to a place where sometimes I do have those places, those feelings of shame and judgment, and where's my husband, where are my kids, what have I been up to? So I got stuck in that practice a little bit yesterday when we were doing it, and I had a tough time getting through it. So I would invite you to take some time and do this. Because it really can help open up that heart space a little bit. And what it did is it brought me back to appreciating and recognizing all the good things that I have done. Right, I have my book coming out next month, and I'm building up my my career here in Hollywood. And so there's a lot of good elements, and it depends on. And you were gracious enough to help me frame it. You can frame it good or you can frame it bad, but I think without even recognizing how much is under the surface that we are judging in terms of self-judgment. And going through this practice, and I think the key is going to be to sticking to this practice.
Yeah.
How often do you recommend somebody do this?
Yeah, every day. So this is something that I do every day. When I first started doing it, when I really was working through all this, loving all the aspects of self that I hadn't loved, and really recreating and developing this relationship with my inner self. There would be I would do it many times throughout the day, and especially when uncomfortable emotions or negative emotions came up that were hard for me to feel, and I felt like I was avoiding. Yeah. Then those would be the times I'd really spend time doing the I love you practice, like I love you, or sometimes I'd even say to the one who's feeling sadness, I love you. So I'd get really ninja at loving different aspects of myself, and that created greater love and greater internal safety, so that I felt safe to feel those emotions. And it even got to the point where I made friends with fear, to the point where fear was no longer an obstacle to overcome. I made friends with sadness, where sadness was no longer something to avoid. I made friends with loneliness, and loneliness became a bridge to oneness. And I made friends with boredom, and boredom became a state of bliss. And so your relationship with negative emotions that you may be currently avoiding or escaping from or not able to feel, you can transform that through this practice. Because what I realized when I was in prison, I realized I had a lifetime of unfelt emotion. Because when all the stuff that we go through in life, when we don't take the time to fully feel through those emotions, they don't go away. Like whatever, there's a saying that whatever you're feeling is healing, and that emotions come up to be felt and acknowledged. They can move through your body, but if you don't take the time to do that, it's staying in your body, and it creates a weight. It creates a weight in your body that's holding you back from fully accessing your greatness. And that as you take the time to do this, and I love the simplicity of it. And don't, again.
Yeah, I think it's the simplicity that threw me off, because it sounded, in theory, before I did it with you, before we took the time to walk me through it, and we spent a good probably 15, 20 minutes doing it. So, I mean, we did it here for 30 seconds for you, but we really delved into a lot of stuff there. I had underestimated the power of it because it sounds so simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes, and I would say in many cases, the most powerful and the most meaningful and purposeful things are many times the simplest. And the reason that I was able to so easily access or understand it and recognize it right away when I first learned it was because I had done so much other stuff. So let me say, I had spent 20 some years on a personal development spiritual journey, doing all kinds of other stuff, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, workshops and spiritual awakening retreats and things. And then when I learned this, I was like, oh my God, this is simple. This is easy. I can do it anytime, anywhere. And if there was one single thing I could tell anybody I would ever meet that would make the greatest impact on their lives from all my experience, and this is the same thing, that if I could go back to my younger self, like what would I tell my younger self, like my 18-year-old self? It's this I love you practice, and to do it consistently, to do it daily. Because what it will open up for you, what it will give you access to, what it will heal inside of you, the relationship it will change with your emotions, the relationship it will change with your external world, the place in which you will be able to create life from will transform from this one thing.
Wow. Chris, you offer consulting both from a business perspective with your company, Wise Profits, but also through a mentoring organization that you've set up.
Yes.
For men primarily, called the Evolved Alpha.
Yes. If
people want to reach out to you to learn more, because you've got so much to share, where can they find you?
Yeah, it's so on my Instagram page, it's ChrisWise24. That's a great way to follow, because on my Instagram page, I post stuff about the consulting and about the Evolved Alpha. And then, of course, people can message me right through there. Instagram, It's ChrisWise24. And, of course, on my Facebook page, and then I also have a Wise Profits Facebook page.
Great. And that's at Chris Wise.
Chris Wise,
on Facebook.
Yeah, Chris Wise.
Wow.
Yeah, on Facebook.
We are at the top of our hour. There's so much more that we could get into, but I thank you so much, number one, for taking the time to be here with us today, and number two, for being so open with your story, and number three, for helping to shed light on this, because I think what's holding society back is generally a lack of love, but we don't recognize how much of that is stemming from internal. And if we all just took the time to start to love ourselves a little bit more, I know that I'm going to continue this I Love You practice. Because again, I was thrown by how powerful it is, and we can get into some of that on a different show. I would love to invite you back, sir, to talk a little bit more about some of your projects, some of the ways people can work with you. But for now, we do need to let you go. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This was another episode of LA40 here on LA Talk Radio and television station here that we have. I'm your host, Katerina, and we're going to have to see you again next week.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye now.
You're listening to LA40 with Katerina Cozias, only on LA Talk Radio.